meditations of all our hearts be ever pleasing in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I'm going to use the same image I actually used last week in the weekly blast. I feel like this morning Jesus just needs to eat a Snickers. Jesus is so angry, it feels like. Such an aggressive text that we're not used to. We're not used to hearing this kind of cut and dry, black and white Jesus. Just eat a Snickers, Jesus. Go back to that kind and healing and comforting man that we know. I don't like this Jesus. This is that other person coming in and playing Jesus. This is the real Jesus. We Lutherans, we struggle to hear this passage. We struggle to hear this passage because it is all about the law. It is law on law on law. It's picking up on what we heard in the Old Testament, talking about the law and how prosperity comes through the law. And I set life and death before you. Follow God's commandments and you will have life. Jesus is picking up on that theme, saying, these are the laws. Is it not better for you to follow these laws that God has put down than to be thrown into hell? Now, I don't mean to go over too much of what you've heard in your confirmation classes. Hopefully you remember. And if you're new to all this, then welcome to Lutheranism. You're going to get a quick crash course right now. But we Lutherans look at this passage and we often go, we don't need all that law. We don't need all that because we're the grace people. God's grace is what saves us, not the law, not those commandments, not those thou shalt not murder. That doesn't save us. It's God's grace and God's unfailing love that we constantly come back to. When we know we've sinned, when we know we've done wrong, we keep falling back on God's grace. And it's only through our faith in God's grace and God's love and in God that we are saved. We're the grace people. So we don't need all that law, because we like the grace. So the issue is, we do need that law. In fact, Martin Luther had a very strong view of the law and the point of the law. And as I keep saying, well, I do mean God's law here, the commandments, things like that. I'm not talking politics. We can do that another time. But this law stuff, it has two uses in Luther's view. There are two uses of the law. The first use is that use that we all know, that when if you do the law, if you fulfill the law, the kind of Old Testament law of Exodus up to even before Jesus was crucified, if you do everything that's appointed, you will go to heaven and you will have salvation. If you fulfill the law, you check off all the boxes, you do every single thing that has been laid out for you. That's the first use of the law. Kind of hard, isn't it? It's kind of a lot. You kind of have to be the perfect person to use the first use of the law to gain salvation. It's nearly impossible. We only know one person who's done it, and they put him on a cross. But there's a second use of the law. The second use is the idea that the law brings us back to grace. That because the law is so insurmountable, because it just heaps more and more requirement and more of what we're supposed to do in life, and we are so frail and human, that we look at this huge list of laws, that we see this mountain in front of us, and we go, there is no way I can do this, and I certainly can't do it alone. And the only way I'm going to scale that mountain, the only way that I might even have a chance, is to fall before God's grace and say, I need you. So the first use of the law is fulfilling the whole law, climbing the ladder, doing it all yourself. The second use is the understanding that it's so big that it forces us back into God's grace. Every time we fail, every time we can't scale the mountain, every time we realize we're not good enough on our own, the law pushes us back and says, fall back on God. Fall back on God's love. And when many people hear the gospel passage we heard today, they lean very heavily into that second use of the law. And it makes sense, because Jesus is telling us to cut off limbs if they should cause us to sin. I wouldn't have any eyes left, maybe not even any arms. We all sin. And it seems ridiculous what Jesus is proposing. So they say Jesus is being extreme here. Jesus is angling at that second use of the law, trying to get us to realize we're not going to do it on our own, to fall back on God's grace, to fall back on God's love. Jesus is over-exaggerating. He's setting an impossible standard for us to help us realize what we need to do. Jesus didn't really mean what he said. It's often where that line of thinking can end up. And in some ways, it's right and it makes sense. And yet, at the same time, Jesus is perfect. Jesus is Christ on earth. And I think Jesus knew exactly what Jesus was saying every time Jesus said it. He means what he says, every word of it. Because that first use of the law is still a thing. We may not be able to do it, but it's still there. It still prescribes how we are to live our lives. Now, I will admit, in this passage, the whole bit on divorce needs to be a little more nuanced. There are still some seeping in of some cultural things going into this. But overall, the law of God is still the law of God. And we just can't throw out the idea that there's this prescribed, non-sinful way to live our lives. We will fail at it. We know we won't fulfill it fully. We know that we won't get there, but we also know the law is there to tell us how our lives are to be lived. So what do we do? Because to go to extremely to the second use of the law is to kind of negate what Jesus says, or to at least say we don't need to care about it, because we're just going to fall back on God's grace. But to go towards the first use of the law, we're never going to get there. We're sinful. And that's where I love Martin Luther again. Because if there's one thing you know about Martin Luther, almost all of his theology lives somewhere in the gray area between the absolutes. Luther didn't have too many times where he said, this is exactly what a thing is. Luther would go towards the middle of the path and say, there's somewhere in the middle here that we're called to be, and we're going to have to wrestle with it and figure it out. And I think there's a middle place here in the Lutheran understanding of the law. Because our gospel passage would lose a lot of heft and meaning if we just write it off. We just say, well, Jesus didn't really mean what he was saying. He was just over-exaggerating to get us to understand. But if we follow that thinking, we're not taking seriously how we live our lives and how we care for our community and our neighbors around us and the call to live and follow the teachings of Christ. But at the same time, if we follow exactly what Jesus said, again, we'd all be walking around without legs. So we go for the middle ground. We go for the middle path where we know we will fail, where we hear those laws and we see that checklist and we know we must fall back on God's grace. We know we're going to have to come to confession. And we know every time we confess, God will forgive us and love us all the more. We follow that path while at the same time trying to live into that beautiful community God has called us into, and trying to follow those laws and statutes and things that call us to be better people in better community and better service to others. We won't achieve it on our own. But as we work together, we'll get glimpses of that kingdom of God, and it will help us to know where we are being called. And it may seem futile that we always fail. But each time we help the love of God break into the world, and that seems pretty worth it to me. We will try to live into the laws of God, to the teachings of God, not for our own glory, not so that we can gain salvation, but because it's what we're called to do. The laws of God are not merely a suggestion, but at the same time, they do help us realize how much we need God's grace. And they do set up an impossible standard for us frail human beings. I invite you into the tension of those two things. Hold that tension. Live in it, wrestle with it, figure out how God is calling you to live your life.